Hello and welcome to Water Stories, the podcast. I'm Eve Barro, and this podcast is a production of BioBAT Art Space. As we embark on each episode, we invite you to immerse yourself in exciting discussions that illuminate the vitality of water, echoing the themes explored by the artists featured in our Brooklyn exhibition on show until June 2025. Enjoy! Today we are speaking with Anna Macleod. Anna is an independent visual artist and researcher based in Ireland. She works around complex ideas associated with contemporary, historical, and cultural understandings of land and water through a variety of visual art media. For several years now, she has been conducting a fascinating project called Water Conversations to explore the space that exists at the intersection of water, landscape, and human cultures. Anna, thank you so much for joining us today to have this conversation. I can't wait to hear more.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's nice to talk about all things related to water.
To start off, I'm really curious about the genesis of Water Conversations. So I'm wondering if you could tell us more about where the idea and inspiration for this long project originated and what motivated you to embark on this long-term research, exploring water politics, traditions, and practices globally.
In the early 2000s, just around the time of the millennium, I moved to the northwest of Ireland from Dublin. And really, I was gentrified out of Dublin because of prices it was the time of the Celtic Tiger period in Ireland. And it was becoming impossible to stay in Dublin because of costs of living, etc. So I moved to the northwest to a county called Leitrim. And I was very lucky to arrive at a time where Leitrim County Council were being very supportive of the artists that were moving into the locality, as well as the local artists, all the blow-in artists like myself. So it was the beginning of the Leitrim Sculpture Centre in Manorhamilton. And we were, as individual artists, we were very well supported by the county council. And during that time, they employed a curator called Cliona Shaffrey, who was looking at ways to expand the experience of rurally based artists. Leitrim is a very small county, and how do you support artists in a rural setting? And how do you get them into kind of some sort of international milieu? And it was Cliona's idea to invite artists from around the world to come and mentor the artists in Leitrim and provide some sort of like a mentoring program, but then also just to talk about the possibilities beyond Ireland. As you probably know, Ireland has really very little art market. Really, artists in Ireland don't survive by selling their work. It's so small and it's so niche area that really we rely very heavily on public funding from the state and from our local county councils and from the Arts Council of Ireland. One has to accept that you're not going to be an artist that can sell work, but that you can be an artist living a life through teaching or workshops and also through support from the state. This was a really wonderful opportunity. And in our case, I applied for this program and they invited Alfredo Jar to come over from New York. He's a Chilean artist based in New York. And he'd come over and with 6 artists from Leitrim, he really interrogated our practices and helped us focus maybe. And it was a very movable feast of how we were going to engage with him. But he really forced us all into kind of a deep examination of our practices and what was important within those practices. If maybe there was an unfocus going on, he helped just by being really quite brutal, but very helpful in many ways. And so we managed to get funding from the Arts Council on the basis of a programme that we came up for and had a group exhibition in 2008. This was a year-long engagement with Alfredo. He came back and forth and encouraged us. So that was my very first water-related project where I did rainwater harvesting. I built a sculpture that rainwater harvested the rain and purified it through solar power and made a drinking fountain in the public space so that people could get water without spending money. They could refill their water bottle with safe, clean water from Leitrim. And so this very first project was really a look at infrastructural failure and failure of water systems in Ireland And this was a kind of multifaceted infrastructural failure. Again, Ireland became independent from the British Empire in the early 1920s, but had inherited an infrastructure of water from the British colonists. And this colonization, really, I suppose it hadn't really been looked at very deeply. And by the early 2000s, the water system was failing. And so there was massive infrastructural failing. It was a failure of government to address water qualities, but it was also a failure of planning permission, effluent getting into water sources, etc. So during this time, I'd embarked on the idea of water harvesting and looking at technologies in Germany, looking at European technologies, grey water. So none of these systems existed in Ireland at that time. So grey water harvesting, rainwater harvesting, and using solar power to engage with these systems. So a non-chemically based way of cleaning water using UV power and filtering systems. So that was my first project. And then beyond that, I thought, well, this is really a project about colonialism. And, you know, the British Empire was such a massive power across the globe. Why not start looking at infrastructural failure in water systems in former British colonies? So this brought me to India, West Africa, Canada, United States, Australia, UK, just to name a few.
That's so fascinating to be taking this approach where you have a very clear angle of looking at, okay, water structures and the legacy of colonialism and how this affects people currently. I'm wondering if through your work in all these different places, with also maybe the different local realities of working with different people, if you found commonalities in all these different places, or if you had any surprises in terms of what you were expecting to explore during this project.
Yes, of course. If you look at different countries and continents that I, over the next sort of 10 to 15 years, started to explore, you're looking at really vastly different cultures that have developed since independence from the British colonial system. And in some cases, there's been privatization of the water, which has been, like in the case of Ghana in West Africa, they privatized for a while, and then it was considered such a complete and utter disaster that they reversed the privatization back into state control. And so this is an interesting point where looking at failures of privatization and how if you put a capitalist model on water, then you're setting yourself up for failure, because it's always going to be about profit and not about provision of healthy, clean water to your population. And we're very familiar with that trope all across the world. But the things that I found really quite so extraordinary, really, despite engaging with very diverse cultures, was the commonalities. So there are huge commonalities of how we humans engage with water. Water is such a fundamental core structure to our lives, to our climate, to our food production, to our very existence, that there are very similar taboos that have been generated across cultures around contamination of water. And of course, when you scale, this usually works on a kind of more local scale, but when you scale it up to national or international scale, this is where these relationships get lost and they get buried. Again, infrastructural failure, or because the structure becomes so vast that it fails in itself. So I thought it was nice to just drill back down into what are the things that are affecting water in such massive scales that affect local populations and affects the global. And of course, one of those would be, what are the different sets of knowledge that come into play in the geopolitics of that? And one of them that's a combined commonality across all places is mining. Now, we're complicit in mining because we all benefit from mining in one way or another, for the infrastructure of our houses, for plumbing, for everything. Our mobile phones, we're talking across we're talking on a device that involves a huge amount of mining. And as we all know, mining is a very dirty process. There's no clean mining. We're complicit in all these. But just to go back, I could talk more about that in a minute, but just to go back to this, so there were a number of areas where I found this commonality and the dialogue changes. But say, for example, tar sands in Alberta. So when I was in Banff, I looked at the kind of how the tar sands were affecting not only the kind of global weather systems, but also the local indigenous populations, and then further on downstream. And of course, with climate change, there's this huge, big unknown. What's going to happen? Like, scientists in Canada are extremely worried about permafrost melting, because, of course, embedded in the word perma is it was always supposed to just stay there forever. And so a lot of mining effluent and petrochemicals have been dumped in permafrost in Canada over the many years that mining has been happening. And of course, so there's a huge fear that as glaciers melt, it's going to bring with it permanent damage to aquifers. And of course, aquifers are our global family silver. And if you contaminate your aquifer, then you're really in big trouble. And as much as that is depleting. So the tar sands in Canada was one area that I looked at. And then in Australia, I looked at mining in Broken Hill. Broken Hill is one of the oldest mining communities. That is really just, it's a city that was built around mining. But of course, they're reaching the end game now, that a lot of the mines are depleted and exhausted, but they have left behind a legacy of failing water infrastructure systems, bad management of land, and its uses. It's now they're diverting water from the Murray Basin for farming cotton, of all things. It's not a kind of landscape that's really set up for that. So the misuse of the really rare and precious water sources. So that's the Australian story. In the Gobi Desert, again, it's mining again. This is where you meet Canadians again, over from Canada, exploiting the Gobi Desert. And of course, the Gobi Desert has an awful lot of the minerals and metals that we need for our devices. So, but they're diverting water sources. Once again, we know how water greedy mining is. So they're diverting water sources so that the traditional patterns of the herders of Mongolia and that have been crossing the desert for millennia is being disrupted by diverted water. So that's a similar story to Broken Hill in Australia, to the tar sands. Then you go to Colorado, again, the Colorado River. There are tailings piles leaching into the Colorado River from historical mining, especially mining for gold. Gold in them there hills actually meant just a legacy of a lot of tailing piles leaching heavy metals into the water basin. Santa Fe, New Mexico, of course, you've got the legacy of uranium mining and weapons industry, nuclear power. It's so multifaceted, it's to dig down deeply into any one of those things. But of course, in Santa Fe, I did some redemptive walks, and the idea was to just look at how much support we need to give communities that are impacted by mining. Like, we need to show, I grew up in a kind of socialist mindset. I believe in solidarity between peoples of the world, and therefore, like in the artworks and the actions that I've done across these different territories, I've really tried to just show solidarity and to raise awareness for these issues, which are, we all know mining happens and we all know that it has a nasty legacy, but we don't really, it's just hard to contemplate, really.
Really interesting how it's almost like you're making these cross sections of, okay, I'm going to look at this certain place, but then you also pay so much attention to the sort of multi-layered reality of what is happening specifically in Australia or in Canada. You mentioned hearing anxiety from the scientific community, but also from maybe the indigenous people there. So I'd love to hear more about these collaborations or conversations that you're having with lots of different people from the community. Might it be scientists, might it be people that are affected in their daily life about maybe the contamination of the water? Would you have an example of a project where you were able to talk to a lot of different people in order to have a sort of better grasp of the reality there?
Yeah, my usual strategy is I've been articulating a lot of these visits to places, and I've been doing them through residencies. So I find a residency in a place that I want to examine the water cultures in. And then it's only when I get there that I realize what I might find, what the problems are. I didn't expect to go to Santa Fe Art Institute. It was a year-long project they were doing, looking at water rights, having different artists there, and also writers and anthropologists. A huge number of people came to examine, and I didn't really expect that I would end up looking at the nuclear industry, but I suppose when you're in Santa Fe, you're near Los Alamos. So in that case, what I did was I went along to the legislature, the Roundhouse, where there was a number of protests taking place, and I met people from Nuke Watch, and I met Indigenous people who were looking for more rights, particularly the Navajo Nation, who were impacted by the 1979 tailings pile disaster on the Puerco River. They were looking for reparations. So that's how I got involved in that. So what I do is I go into archives, but I go to like community groups and ask them what's affecting them most seriously to do with water. So I try and find, so that's a kind of strategy of engaging. It's important to try and do, I find, to get deep into that and to build a kind of solidarity engagement with people in different communities. It's important to spend as much time as possible. Sometimes residencies are too short, I think. They expect you to drop in, parachute in, and make some sort of meaningful engagement for a very short period of time. I think you need 2 months at least, to really build any kind of relationship, or really dig down deep into what are the real factors that are impinging on people's lives. And of course, you need time in archives. Last summer, I spent almost a month in the Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh, just looking at the herbarium. It takes such a long time to sift through documents and spending time in libraries. It's just very time consuming type of practice that I have. But having said that, and then just working with the materials as well, I try and pick materials that are local or have some sort of legacy to the local. And that's, in terms of a particular project, I think the one I'm doing at the moment is I'm working with the Water of Leith Conservation group, who are looking at a river in Edinburgh. Now, this is a success story. Having gone through my practice looking at sort of absolute disasters and following a strategy of walking as witnessing through some of the performance works that I've done, has been a kind of looking at witnessing or drawing attention to the witnessing, but also drawing attention to the kind of mourning of that, because I think we're all facing into a kind of psychological crisis when it comes to the environment and climate, and this man-made climate change, which we now realize is man-made, and our complicity in it. I felt that just to go back to the pandemic, gave me time to really reflect. I think it gave a lot of people time to reflect. And I realized that, the practice of visiting these really damaged areas where water was extremely under stress and really damaged was actually affecting my mental health, and that I had to shift away a little bit and start looking at positive stories. So Edinburgh and the Water of Leith Conservation Trust is a positive story. And so over 20 years, they have turned what was a running sewer into a clean water where flora and fauna are back. The common plants on the side of the river are coming back. Because of the condition of the water has improved. These plants that have always grown by side rivers, but had been outcompeted by invasive species, are making a comeback with the help of the Conservation Trust. And so things like caddisfly larvae are back. So the microcosms of the river are regenerating. And I felt that I needed to concentrate on a positive story. So that's the one I'm working on for the next couple of years, will be this engagement with the Water of Leith, because I just needed to have something positive to do with water. Otherwise, it's just too overwhelming.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The feelings that even I hear from the people I've been talking to. There's always this balance of the grieving and the mourning associated to witnessing how certain environments are changing or how they're affected also by our direct action. And then there's this other side, which I think is really exciting to encounter. And I didn't necessarily expect people to tell me about this, but there's this real joy that people get from spending time with these like non-human entities and witnessing how they live and witnessing maybe certain environments coming back to life. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about this actually non-human entity that you encounter in your work. I know that you've been working, I think, in the Aran Islands. I think that was maybe a few years ago with the local community and keeping in mind pollinators. I think you're also conducting a project with caddisflies. So I'm wondering about, if you could tell us more about how you work with also non-human entities, and if you could tell us more about a certain one that you find particularly interesting in your work.
I was involved in a project called Eco Showboat by two artists, Cleary Connolly, and they're based in France, but they did this giant waterways, solar-powered journey through the waterways of Ireland and along the Shannon, which is the biggest river in Ireland, biggest river in the United Kingdom, in fact, in the British Isles. And of course, it's located in Ireland. But so their journey, and along the way, they engaged with local artists in different parts along the journey. And I was selected to be one of the artists to work with that. Now, so they chose Lough Key, which is in Roscommon, next door to Leitrim, as a site for where I would be making engagement. And Lough Key is a series of, it's part of the Shannon River, but it's also a series of lakes around the beginning of the Shannon River before it turns into the really mighty river that it becomes later on. And it's a very important river in Ireland because, of course, it provides water for actually most of the population in the west coast of Ireland. And in fact, there's even plans afoot to, because of the growing population in Ireland, in Dublin, there's some plans to use some of the water from the River Shannon for Dublin, although this is a much contested space anyway. But back to the Eco Showboat. So they were looking at, I'd already done a project in Lough Key looking at the mayfly and how the mayfly life cycle, the ephemera of the mayfly, it hatches, it lives for one day and then dies, but it is a huge contributor to the ecosystem and the biodiversity of these shores. And the mayflies are very important. And then having worked with that, I was working with some scientists, water scientists, who were interested in, and they said really what's more important even than the mayfly is the caddisfly, because it again contributes to biodiversity. It's a food source for so many different, something like 300 species of different things, and therefore is a very important. So this is what brought me to the caddisfly and the mayfly. So working with these entities, it's really been extraordinary to see how they're such survivors. It's an insect form that has been around since Permian period of the global history. So they've outlived ice ages, and they're really quite extraordinary survivors. And I think we can learn a lot from this idea of survival. How can we adapt and change in order to engage with new realities as they come? So watching these little survivors as they swim about the place and hatch and live these extraordinary lives. The mayfly, really, it's a 24-hour phenomenon. They come out of the larva, you can watch them. They do a mating dance. They mate. They die. They lay eggs. They die. It's like extraordinary. I suppose it's a bit like our lives in the great scheme of time. It's like our lives. So we have very short time on Earth as well. What do we do? How can we do it? How can we show care towards the things that are around us? And one of them is to show care for the water and all the creatures that live in it. And so this is my focus now, and trying to raise awareness. So part of the Eco Showboat was working with children from the local national school. And these are children of farming community. And these are the inheritors of the landscape into the future. And quite intensively, I worked with them on a kind of art science project where we looked at water, we looked at the health of water, we looked at the biodiversity and life within, within the water and what the threats are. In Ireland, we don't have mining as much. We have very little mining, and we're fighting against any mining, really. But we do have agriculture, and agriculture is one of the biggest polluters, as is commercial forestry. So there are big threats here. And working with the young folk in the school, they were like 12, 13-year-olds, we explored what can be done in order to protect the waters and protect the complex bio life that is invisible, but it's because these things are so small, a lot of people are unaware. So really, I felt it was important to engage them in making sculptures. We made the life cycle of the mayfly, huge sculptures out of willow and paper. And we talked about the life cycle and how this was really important, because they came up with really interesting questions then. How do I, and they were going home and telling their parents not to use chemicals in the toilets. And yeah, it was interesting. They feel a huge responsibility. I didn't want to frighten them. It's a very delicate balance to talk about these issues without terrorizing the younger generation, making them depressed or making them feel hopeless. This was an attempt to together explore and what we can do and try not to terrorize them. But when I was working with Mary Kelly Quinn from UCD, she came to the Eco Showboat event that we had in Lough, and she talked about there's a frightening loss of biodiversity in Ireland's rivers, which 40, 50 years ago were considered pristine. So there's an accelerating loss of biodiversity, so the loss of biodiversity in water is greater than the loss of biodiversity on land. It's happening faster globally, and particularly in Ireland, where shockingly we had pristine waters up until relatively recently. What can we do to reverse that? And how do we bring the farming community on board? So it's a massive project, really, working. So I am working with the farming community at the moment, and I'll be doing some talks on farms where we're looking at creative ways to engage with the landscape and through the farm community. It's always a case when you're working on environmental projects that at the same time it's building solidarity and not blaming or finger pointing. You can blame big industry for sure, or the lack of protections from the environmental protection agencies or lack of government. But when you're dealing with individuals, it's a very delicate balance of pointing out, how we're all stakeholders in this, and a healthy landscape benefits us all culturally and psychologically. And the psychological damage of polluted water is massive, absolutely massive. If you look at studies that people have done, for example, in England, there's such a massive crisis going on there. With the privatisation of the water has turned out to be a total disaster. And they're saying now 85% of the rivers are polluted beyond redemption. Now, there's always redemption. I think that's what I'm trying to point out in my work at the moment. There's always redemption. It can be turned around, but it's just making sure that people realise that it's a very concerted community effort that has to be put in order to turn it around, and you can't wait for a government to do it.
Yeah, I love how you said there's always redemption. That gives hope. And also the fact that you shared that the children you were working with after the workshops were having their own questions and thinking about how they can live in a different way, or maybe they can tell their parents now that they have this knowledge about things that maybe they hadn't considered before. I think that's really inspiring. Solidarity seems to be something that's really central to your practice, both solidarity with local communities, but also with local environments, with also different entities and non-human entities that live within these environments, and then also with maybe the global challenges that people can face, which of course have local realities, but maybe are mirrored in different places. And something that I find really interesting is at the beginning, when I asked you about the genesis of this project, you mentioned, I think, how maybe the fact that you're based in Ireland and your own interest led you to conduct maybe more workshops and learning activities. And you also, I think, mentioned how rurality was central in your practice and that you were working with farming communities. So maybe as a final big question, I'm wondering if you could tell us more about the place that art and creativity has to play within different communities, and maybe not only art is something that you would walk into a museum and just see, because you mentioned the importance of doing workshops and doing with. I think that's also central, with people, doing with communities, doing with environments and species. So maybe, yes, as a final question, how do you see this creative doing with maybe leading us to this redemption that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think I've noticed a big change in people's practices since the pandemic. I just mentioned that briefly before, that it shifted a lot for me because of all the research I'd done into the kind of contamination taboos of the past. And then you were asking me about commonalities, global I was thinking, like, one of the ones was milk. Like in West Africa, in village life, you never pour milk into the river, and here you never pour milk into the river. Farmers never wash out their milk trucks, because it suffocates the fish and the smaller invertebrates. And therefore, as I was pondering this, we had one of the longest downs in Europe, in Ireland. So we were locked down for very many months. So I live very rurally, but I began to communicate. The only people who were still working were farmers. They had to continue working. So past my house was trundling tractors. So I started thinking more and more about and reaching out to the farming community. That's when I started working with Jerry Bowen, who's a farmer in South Leitrim, but he's also a storyteller. And so in the 3 years that we've been working together, we've been exploring local cures and customs related to water, but also then expanding out into how the water has shaped the landscape and therefore is intrinsic to the very ground we stand on. Of course, this part of Ireland has been formed by the Ice Age. So the retreating glaciers have carved out the mountains here and the valleys. And so I live in a glacial landscape. So I'm so interested in that now. I'm interested in how the landscape is defined by water and it rains a lot. So it is water and is defined by water. So rain-fed land. So we started looking at the mythologies and folklore related to farming practice and to the spirituality that's still embedded. In Ireland, we have what's called a half belief. So we still believe, people call it the fairies, but we believe in spirits beyond, and I would characterize it as the spirits of land. So we believe in goddesses, and we have creation myths that go beyond. But it's been, the Catholic Church has appropriated those. For example, like just recently, where we had the start of the Celtic Spring Imbolc, and Imbolc starts on the 1st of February. And it's been appropriated by the Catholic Church into St. Bridget's Day, but it's actually Breed, which is the goddess of all things. And so we make crosses from the rushes of the land. Now, these are wet land rushes, so they're made by water. It's only when your water is landlocked that you end up with the rushes. And so we make cruciforms, but these are not related to Catholic religion. These are sun symbols. So the way the sun moves clockwise around the earth, these are sun symbols, and they're made every year for the feast of Bridget. Okay, so you're welcoming in the spring after the long winter through the goddess of, and this is where people go to holy wells and spring wells, and they're very much revered. So in our 3 years working together, we've been looking at these cures and belief systems and the half beliefs in things. So we focused as well on the hawthorn tree. And the hawthorn tree is the portal to the underworld through which much magic happens. And then we're also looking at the health benefits. So the hawthorn tree grows on very wet land and is considered the portal to the underworld, where the fairies exist, the spirits live. And so whenever you're taking something from the hawthorn tree, like blossoms to make tinctures or teas, you ask the tree for, or you leave a gift to the tree. So there's still a very strong tradition in Ireland of leaving offerings on trees. And this is a nod towards that there is something else controlling, some other force controlling how we are on the world and what the weather brings. It's not just us. I've been very embedded in this world now for the couple of years, and it's changing my practice a little bit. But there's been a huge resurgence in people being interested in folklore now, and there's a lot of projects running in Ireland, and a rediscovery, something that got lost in Irish rural traditions. They got lost in kind of mechanization. So from the 1970s, when Ireland began to be a little bit more prosperous, a lot was left behind. And one of the things that was left behind were these knowledges about the landscape and its temperaments. And it's, some call it superstition, but I would say belief systems in cures. And there are a lot of cures that have no cures for livestock, cures for humans, that have really no basis in science, but work. The hawthorn itself works. We've been making tinctures from it. It actually works. There are the entities, the non-human entities in our landscape can heal us or harm us. And it's recognizing what are healing. So there's a lot of interest all of a sudden now in herbalism and belief systems beyond organized religion. And this is changing my practice. I'm in a kind of transition at the moment. It's transformation, really. This is stuff I knew before, but like I was exploring it in deeper ways through my practice. And I think it gives us hope. But it's just like a return to belief systems that were already there. But we lost somewhere in capitalism. We lost this ability to, and also maybe we believed in science. We thought science would end. I remember even believing that science would end world hunger. And it would fix everything. So anything we broke, we could fix. And this has proven to be not really working in the way that we might have hoped. So now we're looking at to the intangible heritage, cultural heritage of our belief systems and our cultures in order to try and heal in a different way. And so that has become very important in the practice and in the respect for water. And as you said, making the invisible visible, because there's magic and faith in what you can find under the surface of the water.
I think that's a beautiful statement to finish with. I'm really happy to have caught you at this sort of step in this transformation in your practice that you just mentioned. I think it's the sort of resonance between maybe going back or appreciating again this knowledge that we have as communities about the landscapes, and at the same time thinking about, how can we also appreciate again the water and the biodiversity within the water, and how can we sustain this? I love the parallel, and I think it makes a lot of sense. So thank you for your answers. Thank you for listening to this episode. We hope you enjoyed it. You can find all of our other episodes online on our platforms, as well as in our listening room in our exhibition space in Brooklyn, New York. Bye!